Good afternoon. As you are explaining, I am the coordinator of special academic activities here in UPF. And for me, it's a great pleasure to be here in the opening session of the third Global Week. It will be a whole week focused on the links between, as you know, between globalization and gender. If you search the definition of globalization, probably you will find Giddens' quote. He stated that globalization can be defined as the intensification of worldwide social relations, which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. For other authors, globalization implies all those processes by which the people of the world are incorporated into a single world society, or another type of definition. Finally, globalization implies the compression of the world and the intensification of the consciousness of the world as a whole. It seems a positive way of the globalization, but probably you know that last week the most expensive meeting in the world finished. I suppose you know that I am talking about Davos. And Oxfam published 2 reports with relevant data about our topic, about globalization. I want to highlight 3 of these main data. Last year, the wealth of the billionaires has increased by $900,000 million. Second point, 26 people have the same wealth as 3,100 million people. In 2017, it was 43 people. Last year, 26. And finally, the third point, men own 50% more of the world's wealth than women. So it seems that globalization perhaps is not so positive around the world. During the different talks of this week, we'll have the opportunity to confront the different sides of globalization. The different speakers will help us to reflect about the economic, political, cultural, ecological, and ideological aspects of globalization, with gender as the main dimension, cutting across the other 5. And all of this occurs here in UPF, in the academia. The academia as the agora, the ancient term to mean a safe place for the debate, the dialogue, and the reflections. There is a common place that identifies university as the place where titles are distributed. I understand this complaint, and sometimes I feel sad because I have to agree with it. But examples as this week and this program help me to keep hope. University is not only a sort of courses. University is the place where we have the opportunity to debate about the dark side and the bad consequences of whatever. And it's not only an opportunity, because it's our job. We have to be critical, not in the sense of a negative emotional reaction. Critical thinking implies knowledge about the topic, calm reflection about data, the capacity to attain different perspectives and theoretical positions, passion in the heart, calm in the dialogue. And doing so, we have the possibility, or perhaps we have the responsibility, to think and design the best world we can imagine. I invite you all to hear and think. Thank you, Rosa, for all your effort, and thank you all for coming.
Okay, I'll be very brief. This is the third Global Week. The first Global Week, there was intentions from the beginning to have special events during the Global Studies program. And one of them was the Global Week. The first year we got, the topic was about Asian Pacific countries. And we have invited faculty from several universities around the area of Asia Pacific, basically from Japan, Korea, China, Australia, and India. The second year, we have a much more modest type of Global Week that was about Mediterranean issues, and we got scholars from different countries of the North African coast, and then some people from the Institute of the Mediterranean here in Barcelona, and some other institutions related to Mediterranean issues. The thing is that from the very beginning, I don't know if you remember, the first years, the first promotion of Global Studies, it's fun to have you all here, because I seem you separated in different classes and have it all combined. It's my favorite thing now. So let me introduce these people to you, Lourdes. There are students from basically very different countries with different backgrounds. There have students from the third year that are ready to graduate, and some students from second year, and there's a 3-year degree, and then students from the first year. Most of them are very worried right now because some of them are returning back from their study abroad. So Rosa is the ones who manage all the study abroad. There are students that have been appointed where they're going to go for the study abroad next year. So they are starting to ask what they should do this and that. And then the first year students are starting to worry what they have to decide next year, what they have to do. So they are very worried about moving, going, and so that's the thing that we have right now here. So let me finish very briefly. Why the decision for gender studies? I don't know if you remember when we opened the degree 3 years ago for the first year students. We got a speech as a speaker, Christina Gaillard, that was the person who was at that moment the subsecretary of communication of the United Nations. After the talk, some of you had the opportunity to interview her, and we asked her what she thinks is the most relevant international issue at in the global agenda. And she said, without any doubt, is gender. Unfortunately, the people who was involved in the definition of the program in global studies were all men. And none of them thought relevant to have a class in gender as a mandatory course. So it was a depth from the very beginning to have a course on gender issues on global studies, and then finally we got it as an elective, and that's the one that Rosa is now teaching. We hope that course will stay, and then probably in the future, when we have to transform the global studies program, after 4 or 5 years, we have to do renewals of what has to be done. Maybe they will have finally a mandatory course in gender issues, and I think it's a much more relevant than we think. That's why I'm so glad that finally we're doing this Global Week in gender issues. It's the only time we've done it on a topic, not on a region. So probably next year, well, we know next year is going to be about African issues, sub-Saharan African issues. But we are working on that right now. So any of you have any ideas, that has to be a very open type of process. So especially for the students who are graduating this year, maybe you can help me next year. And for the students who are still here, they can help me too. So that's where they're going to be next year. So basically, I wanted to give you this short story how these global studies, global weeks work, and why we decided to do gender this year. Thank you, Rosa, for all the work.
Okay. This third edition makes a big change on the assumption of the Global Week. It includes a thematic approach, gender as a big topic in globalization issues, and as a neat tool to understand and construct a better world. To achieve this main objective, we must pay attention to gender inequalities from different fields of knowledge and also in different geographical scales, from our own bodies to international economic and political relations. As the academic convener of this edition, I would like to point out the intention to include diversity of topics and approaches. Today we have one session about the history of gender and development explained by Lourdes Beneria. After, Natalia Rivas Mateos and Núria Gibernau will explain us what is happening with migrants trapped in Libya. On Tuesday, Claudia Padovani will talk about gender equality and media, and Lucia Art Cartoz will point out welfare state's difference in health, work, and gender perspectives. Wednesday, we will have a film screening and debate with Alba Sutorra about her last documentary, and after, Maria Rodó will talk about inequalities from a geographical, emotional, and feminist perspective through e-relief maps. Please take your computers with you. Thursday, Gabriela Méndez will introduce the notion of ecofeminism and green humanities in Mexico, and Jules Falquet will talk about neoliberal globalization and the global reorganization of violence in Latin America and Caribbean. Finally, Friday, Suruchi Tapar will introduce us biopolitics of gender violence, and Pastora Filigrana will close the Global Week with her speech about anti-racism and class feminism to change the world. I hope all interventions will be inspiring and interesting for all of you. In practical terms, I would like to say that all sessions will be here, but I think it will not be like that because we will change, we are tiny space, and we'll start at 4 o'clock every day. On Wednesday, we will move to Poblenou Auditorium starting at 3:30. All sessions will be in English, less both of Thursday and the second one of Friday, that they will be in Spanish. We will have update information in the Humanities Department website and also through Twitter and with the hashtag Global Week UPF. Some volunteers, students from Gender and Globalization course, will introduce each speaker, and they also will write down a summary of each session that we'll be able to check and read in the website. Many thanks to Pilar Medina and Tony Luna for the warm welcoming words, and also to Karina Ortega, who is not here, that makes all the bureaucratic stuff done. Participants for accepting the proposal, and to all of you to be here. Let's start. And Maria, who is a student from our course, will introduce our speaker, Lourdes Beneria, and then we will listen to her.
Okay, thank you. What's the relationship between the process of globalization that rules currently the world and the social construction of gender? How an individual category can be related to economy? Okay, so women represent 50% of the world adult population and 1/3 of the official labor force. They perform nearly 2/3 of the world working hours, receive only 1/10 of the world income, and own less than 1% of world property. This is an extract of the report of the Second World Conference on Women in 1980 from United Nations. Talks, of course, about feminization of poverty. International Labour Organization estimates that the number of domestic workers are around at 67.1 million, sorry. But the organization itself states that the experts say that due to the fact that this kind of work is often hidden and unregistered, the total number of domestic workers could be as high as 100 million. The organization also states that 83% of domestic workers are women, and many are migrant workers. This phenomena is called sex division of work, and this kind of migratory flow is called care drain. Gendering the effects of globalization and, of course, colonialism can explain very well many of our current conditions. For these reasons, we are so fortunate to have here with us the authors of many works of gender, development, and globalization, economics as if all the people matters, feminist economics, and the crossroads of class and gender, industrial homework, subcontracting, and household dynamics in Mexico City. Trained at the University of Barcelona, the London School of Economics, and the Columbia University, Lourdes Beneria is an authorized voice to analyze the current state of economics as an academic discipline. She's credited with many years' careers and prestigious Cornell University of the USA, where she came as professor. But above all, she is recognized for her commitment to the critical economy. The treatment of economics as a complex discipline necessarily implies innovative approaches that, through looks like the feminist, claim the need for an economic that goes beyond of economic benefits and the role of econometrics. So please, we have with us Lourdes Beneria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria, for the introduction. Can you hear me? No, not very well. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I did not expect so many of you. I thought there would be few of you, but that's fine. Thank you for being here. I wish I could be here fully because my head is not working very well. And you might have heard that I almost didn't come because I don't feel well. So I want to warn you and apologize because I may not be the same person I am when I am in front of students because it's always wonderful. I should say that what I will do is I do have a PowerPoint that I wanted to do the presentation, but I can't do it. My head is not working properly. So I'll go over the PowerPoint and we'll make some comments on different slides, and then we will see how we develop, how we continue. I apologize for this, but I almost didn't make it. I'm glad I'm here, though. I should say that I taught a course on gender and development, just like that title, Gender and Development at Cornell, many years, every year, to graduate. It was a graduate course for master and PhD students. Even in the United States, when I started, which was probably towards at the end of the 1990s, to teach a course like that, it wasn't that common, but it is very common now. I was teaching at Cornell University, the north of New York State. It's a beautiful rural area, beautiful city of Ithaca, but it seemed very rural, but it's very international. So I was always surrounded by people like you. When I started, it was only women also, and as time went by, some men kept coming, but not as many as women, as you can imagine. Probably the same thing will happen or is happening here already. What I would like to say is that I've worked and written about gender and globalization a great deal, but and because of that, what I have is something that I wish I didn't have that much, which is what is called, I suppose those of you who are familiar with feminist literature, what in feminist literature we call, and not only in feminist literature, situated knowledge. That is, you know, you see a topic, you think about it, you write about it, but you see it from a certain perspective. I am in Barcelona today, but a lot of what I've done and what I have written about and what I'm going to say has this sort of situated knowledge, because first of all, the gender and development topic hasn't been as big in Spain or in Catalonia as it has been in the United States. It has a history that I'm going to talk a bit about. And so because of that, that's why I have this situated knowledge to some extent. Hopefully, I've been in Spain and I know about it, and also I have worked in other countries in the world that you will not notice as much that kind of situated knowledge to the extent that it might give a bias or a perspective. Well, let's start. Well, as you can see, I call this reflections on a historical path. And I would say, I should even add another adjective before reflections, sketchy reflections on a historical path, because eventually I'm going to talk about how the so-called gender and development field that started in the 1970s has been developing over the years all the way until now. And now, of course, it's much more gender and globalization. The topic, let's say the field of knowledge and work has been developing over the years and has become more globalized as the economy in the world has become more globalized. So I'm beginning with the early years, the 1970s. And you may not be able to understand the way in which women were totally absent from academic world, from books, from research. In the early 70s, I was doing my PhD at Columbia University in New York City, and I was taking courses on economic development, especially economic development in Latin America. And you may not believe, well, of course you will believe it because you know enough about the development of ideas, but there was never mentioning of women in our courses. I was also taking a course on labor economics. Women were perhaps sometimes mentioned as a statistic, but focus of analysis on women didn't exist. In terms of women and development, in the development courses I took, there was no mention. There was no literature, certainly not in the economics department where I was. There had been some people dedicated to women's issues, and that is where my situated knowledge will show. People, anthropologists mostly like Margaret Mead, who you know, especially if you've taken anthropology courses, well known internationally, June Nash, same, Happy Leacock, Helen Safa, all of the three of them, if not Margaret Mead, were specialized on Latin American, and they did a lot of work on Latin American women. At that time, they had already done some. So, but they were the exceptions. In economics, there were not even women who might have done work on women academics, women economists. There was nobody asking the many questions that have come since then, since the 1970s. So the problem was that we cannot even judge what they were saying because they didn't say anything. Now, what happened in the early 1970s that changed, at least it was the beginning of change, it was the two turning points. First was the effects of the so-called second wave of feminism, which the effects started to be felt at the end of the 60s, very end of the 60s, and continued on. And then what showed up was also a book that became what I've called many times the Bible of Women and Development. And that book was written by an economist a Danish economist from Denmark, Esther Bas Rubb, who wrote this book, Women's Role in Economic Development. It was a first. It was a big surprise to those of us who were interested already in women's issues to see that there was a whole book written on economic development. Yeah, she was an economist. She died in the mid-70s, but had a lot of experience at the UN as a UN researcher and somebody who worked in the US, UN US, and UN Europe, she had done a lot of traveling to look at the situation of women in different countries, including the different continents. The book, Women's Role in Economic Development, published in 1970, was a first. And so everything that she wrote was new to us. And what she did in that book was, well, all kinds of things, but opened our eyes to the situation. It was just, if we look at it from now, we know much more, because it's been since the 1970s that she started a field that has moved and grown in different directions. I'm not going to explain in detail or in any depth all the points that I have here. But just let me mention what you can read, which is that what did she do? What was the contribution that Esther Basra made? The one I have as the first one was that she started to make us think about how countries have, and over time, evolved in many different of male, female, sexual division of labor. And in her book, she talks about the female farming system in Africa, something we didn't know at all about. Anthropologists probably did, but those of us who were beginning to think about development had no idea. The female farming systems in Africa, but also the different situations where women found themselves in other continents, like in Asia, a great variety, differences in the sexual division of labor in different Asian countries, great variety. And because of that, she talked about the differences in migration patterns. The migration from the country to the city was already accelerating in many parts of the world. So she talked about the differences not only between Africa and Asia, but also in Latin America. The one basic idea that she contributed with, and that we then talked about for years, was the extent to which colonization marginalized women in the economy. It was through colonization that many gender norms and gender prejudices were introduced by the colonial powers. The European men, for example, when and governed African countries or Asian countries with their own gender norms and mental schemes, to the extent that the newly created jobs, for example, in industry or in urban employment, went to men. And so many women stayed in the countryside where they had been living, and men moved to the countryside, to cities or wherever employment was. So that's why she talked about how development or modernization through colonization marginalized women. And that's why also why she recommended the need to integrate women in development in a way that it had not happened before. And that expression, integrate women in development, became a sort of a recommendation, not just hers only, but many other people. Except that some of us, including myself, who liked the book very much, but didn't quite like some of her recommendations, said, well, yes, of course, women should be integrated in the process of development, but what kind of development? If we have the kind of development that colonization introduced, that was capitalist development, but with a, see, my head is not working well enough. But with lots of biases and problems that the economy suffers, not just for women, but also for men. But many of us said, this is not, we need to ask what kind of development do we want women to integrate into? That was one of the critiques that many of us made of this book. But in any case, the book was a source of inspiration, as I say here, and despite the critiques, it continued to feed many of the research and discussions about gender all over the world in the 1970s. And this is, if I could go a little deeper in this slide, which I won't, let me say that the 1970s, in many ways, from the point of view of gender and development, was represented an expansion of many of the points, many of the analysis, much of the analysis that Bosrop had, into many, many directions. And it had an influence. It was in the 1970s when the UN conferences on the world's women, the decade on the world's women, they were organized. Maybe you don't know that, just let me say that's an important thing you have in the back of your mind. Bosrop already had an influence on what went on the analysis. The first UN conference on the decade of women was Mexico City in 1975. The second one was in Copenhagen, 1980. The third one was in Nairobi, 1985. And the last was somebody mentioned it, was in Beijing in 1995. Those conferences had a tremendous influence. It was very important. There were thousands of women. I think in Beijing there was as many as 15,000 women or more gathered in Beijing. Imagine 50,000 women from all over the world coming to Beijing to discuss all kinds of things. And then, of course, the UN picked up a lot of what went on. And it had an influence worldwide because governments and people from all over the world, those who attended conferences, had to prepare a lot of work before going to those conferences. So I did not, I could also say that parallel to that, there were some smaller academic conferences that developed first in the United States, and because it was mostly located in the United States, there were criticisms of a vision from the developed world, looking at the third world as if they didn't know anything. So over the years, this bias has been more or less corrected, even though it may still exist a bit. There was also an important conference on gender and development in Sussex in 1978, which I remember I attended when I was working at the ILO, the International Labour Office in Geneva. And there was much more international. It was not US dominated, but it was much more representing women or people from all over the world. So that the works proliferated, and we learned a great deal in the 1970s about, you know, I remember I didn't know anything about the extent about women's seclusion in some Asian countries. We had to know that, you know, things that now seem to be we know very well, and we see it seems to, how is it possible that you didn't know that there was women's seclusion? Yes, of course it was, but it was not systematized as our knowledge is now much more. I'm not going to talk about this. I could talk much, but I won't. I worked at the ILO for 2 years in 1978, 79, and that was a wonderful job to look at the world and look at the world's women and development issues from certainly a big privilege of being in Geneva, big contradiction between the privileged work of the ILO in Geneva and thinking about the poorest people in the world, like, for example, many African women. So I learned a great deal. Many topics came out for me there. I have a list of them here. I won't go over them. But one of the big projects for me that came out of there was the ILO is the institution that's in charge of gathering statistics, national at all levels, of work all over the world. And I remember going to Morocco on a mission, as they say at the UN vocabulary. And I realized that the statistics about women's work were totally wrong, because I saw women working all over the place, around the house, especially around the villages, and yet the labor force statistics that I had from for Morocco showed or told me that women's labor force participation was 7-8%. And when I saw so many women working, I realized that something was wrong with the statistics, and I went back to the ILO. That became a favorite project of mine, to think and see how we could figure out a better way of representing how much women work and being underrepresented in statistics. That was Morocco, but that was all the world. And that began what I always have called the accounting project, that is Accounting for Women's Work project, that now is everywhere. And we have, since then, since the late 70s until now, much has been accomplished. We know much more. All governments gather statistics about women's work much more accurately, and not necessarily governments, but also individual researchers, studies about time use. No, we know much more now. There has been a tremendous amount of progress that I'm not going to talk about, including now, let me at least say that my co-author, Maria Floro, has a project now with the government of South Korea, which is a first. I mean, we've known a lot about what women do all over the place. We have much more information, but for the first time now, we have this project, or Maria Flores, my friend, has this project with the government of South Korea, where they are calculating, they're estimating very accurately what is, for example, how much women and men spend time on, for example, care. The care work, which is something that we are all interested in our countries too. It's a focus point for research. But in South Korea, what they want to do is, with a very accurate estimation of this sharing of work at home and the other places between men and women, they want to calculate this so that they can influence macroeconomic policies. So up until now, we've been looking at this from a micro point of view. But now it's moving the analysis to a macroeconomic policy, and it can influence macroeconomic policy. I'm not going to talk about this. Now, the topic here is globalization, and the title of this slide is tempting to spend a little bit more time, but talking about globalization, neoliberalism, and women's work. And I have here subdivided what I wanted to say. First, thinking about multinational corporations and women's work. But we normally think about how multinational corporations have been employing women at the global level since the 80s, 90s. But if we go back, there was a first example that I wanted to mention. I know that some of you are from Latin America here. And some of the first examples of gender and globalization, international employment of women took place already in the 60s in Mexico and U.S.-Mexico border. That was the period of maquiladoras. There was, many of us had not heard this, even the word, for the first time. What were the maquiladoras? Essentially, maquiladoras were and are product of international investment or international capital going to a specific place and generating production of different kinds. Normally, when they employ women, is what is called labor-intensive production, and that's what the maquiladoras were. A lot of U.S. capital that went to the border because they were exempt of taxes and were able to produce cheaper for the U.S., mostly the U.S. market at that time. They employed, I remember the 60s when we started to hear about this phenomenon, 65% of the workers in the maquiladoras at that time were women. And that was a new thing. We did not know of areas with such a large number of investment employing women. I'm sorry, I said 60%. Yes, 65% were women. So that was, we can think of it as a first example of globalization and women's work. But then we've seen so much of it much later. The other second big change that took place in terms of globalization and women's work took place in Southeast Asia. The so-called Asian tigers employed women, multinational corporations from the US first and then from other European countries. They invested in a big way in the late 70s, and that was the first time when the debate about what was happening, the exploitation of women by international capital took place. I remember those debates very much as being new, something we had not talked about before. So there was the beginning of the globalization as we know it now. The 1980s and the 1990s, this is probably something that you already know, were very big in expanding multinational investments all over the world mostly by companies, multinationals from the rich countries going to low-wage countries, which they were at the time, for example, in Southeast Asia, and from then they've moved into different directions, as we know them now. So globalization became like a big word. That word did not exist before the beginning of the 1990s. I was reminding Maria Dolores Garcia Ramon the other day, the first time when I came from the US, and she asked me to give a lecture, and there was some globalization in the title, and she said it's a funny word, maybe put another word. But I said, yes, just leave it, because in the US we were already talking about it, and of course here too, immediately. So the word globalization is not 50 years old. It's from the 1990s or late 1990s. I have here a list of different big research projects that have said a lot about globalization and women. As we know already a lot about how women have become, through globalization, have become the cheapest labor in the world. And we need to talk about exploiting women. How am I doing with that?
It's almost 5.
Yeah, so I'll stop soon. I'm not going to talk about this because it's, what I want to say is that despite this supposed success of globalization in terms of generating employment for women and all over the world, we now are at a point when we have to ask, what has it been like? Has it really been good for women? Because in the let me say something. In the late 1990s and also the decade of the 2000s, there was a lot of questions, this kind of question I just mentioned, has it been good for women or for gender equality? It was a question very often asked. And for the first time, the big international organizations like the World Bank had a reputation not wanting to talk about gender. There was in the mid-1990s, for example, the World Bank did not have any statistics that had to do with gender. It was not an institution that was interested, and in fact it was criticized, but it was not until the 1910s and a bit later when the World Bank started to realize how important globalization and women's employment was, how the feminization of the labor force had changed, the way employment was distributed all over the world. So the World Bank became interested. And in 19, let's see. And in the so-called World Bank report, which is an annual important report that people look forward to see what is it they're going to talk about this year, The 1912 World Development Report had the title of Gender Inequality and Development. Everybody was surprised. Now the World Bank is talking big about gender and development, something has changed. And then in 2014, a second World Development Report also was focused on women's issues, and it was called Voice and Agency. Now, these reports are thick like that. They come out every year. And generally, they were very optimistic about gender equality. Of course, many, many women have moved into the labor force. Of course, women's income had increased in many places. Of course, many women have moved into the professions. And there had been many changes for women during these 2 or 3 decades. That was true. The statistics were very optimistic, for example, around education. Women's educational levels had increased tremendously since the 80s all over the world. For example, cases like in the Middle East, women had moved very much higher into the educational level. In Asia, a lot of illiteracy rates had been lowered to very low levels, and so on. So there were many statistics that were very positive. So the World Bank's evaluation of the effects of globalization on women and gender equality was very, very positive. But the question was, many of us left that, yes, of course, that was all true, and we were happy about it. But the question is that what the gender report, the World Bank reports didn't do was to think about the fact that women were still at the lower levels, despite the fact that they had improved, they were still at the lower levels of the labor force hierarchy. And they were not, the World Bank did not take into consideration the fact that women's poverty was still there, that despite the improvements, the hierarchies between, let's say, professional women, middle-class women, and the poorer women still existed. So the World Bank looked at gender equality. It seemed that gender equality had improved, but did not look at differences that had to do with class, for example, class, hierarchy, and so forth. And so my recommendation, somewhere in what I did here today, is to emphasize the importance when we think about gender equality to also think about class inequality, because women suffer at the lower echelons of the labor market and in terms of wages and access to resources because of class differences. So the question about to respond to the World Bank report was that it was interesting. There were interesting, lots of statistics, who else has more access than the World Bank, but they had the problem of not taking into consideration the fact that not only through class, but also through the men in general, or the population in general, inequalities have increased, as our first speaker mentioned, around the world, and it keeps, the inequalities in the world keep increasing. So when we talk about gender equality or inequality, we also need to talk about exploitation, because women, and it's not enough to talk about inequality without talking about exploitation. What does it mean? It means that many women are working very hard. They do have employment, but who benefits from their work? Well, their work, let me give you the case of Bangladesh. Bangladesh, you probably all have bought some piece of cloth from Made in Bangladesh, a very successful country in terms of having attracted lots and lots of multinationals that employ many women. But in Bangladesh, in 2013, you were probably too young to remember, only there was a big case that was called the Reina Plaza factory collapse, which killed, I don't remember how many,
Over 1,100.
Yeah, here you have it. It was a disaster, and this was successful in terms of export processing, in terms of globalization for the country. And people ask, how is it possible that they have not, over the years, because if this was in 2013, Bangladesh's multinational investment started especially in the 80s and continued all along. So what had happened? My co-author, Gunsela Berrick, went, I think it was in 2016, to do research in Bangladesh and wrote this article. It's called Revisiting the Feminist Debates in International Labor Standards, to look very closely the situation of women in Bangladesh. And despite the success of the exports and how Bangladesh has been doing well in terms of creating employment and also women's employment, she details in her, I mean, I will read it without giving much more comment, that she found a continuous decline in unit price of garments. So Bangladesh was very successful in selling the products made in Bangladesh cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Who benefits from that? We, in the Western world, for example, benefit. That's why we buy Bangladesh goods in the department stores, because they're cheap. Many of the goods have become cheaper, but who has benefited from this production then? Well, the women haven't benefited, because there has been women, for example, they have not decreased their working hours. Still 72 hours a week of work is very large number of hours a week, with she says, adverse health effects and much stress, and particularly for married women. So it means that in these terms, there has not been globalization, and the success of production in Bangladesh has not benefited women. They still are forced overtime. They have verbal and physical abuse and much pressure to meet the export targets. A significant gender gap still exists, that is difference in salaries between men and women. And sometimes they're not paid on time. These are questions that she found, or issues that she researched. And wages barely reaching beyond poverty levels. So where is this export success, the benefits of it, where does it go? It goes to the benefits of the capital, the owners of capital, and that's what exploitation is. And that's what the World Bank report does not pick up. So as this implies, that we need to take into consideration not only women's employment, but also the extent to which their situation as workers and as in terms of income, the income they receive has changed. I'm going to leave you here. Well, just mentioning, I wanted to talk much more in detail about issues. We have had feminization, but also there are many cases of defeminization, which have to be taken into consideration. It means that in some areas of the world, even though women's employment has increased so much, there's been moments, occasions, situations in which women have lost their jobs. One example of this is the Mexico maquiladoras have lost the power that they had in the 1960s. Why? Because wages are much cheaper, or were, especially in the 1980s and 90s when this started, were much cheaper in Asia, in Asian countries, or in South America, further down from Mexico. So there has been a process of defeminization. The proportion of women workers in the 60s was 65%, and now it's much lower. At this point, 2019, I don't know exactly what the proportion is, but it's much lower. Another case of defeminization took place in the 80s and 90s in the Caribbean area. Specifically, there is a book, Marion Werner, who wrote about the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic had several what's called free trade zones, zonas francas, where there was a high proportion of women working. I remember when I did some research in the 90s, in one free trade zone that was called La Romana, 92% of the workers there were women. In the 80s and in the 90s and even further, they have lost because investment has moved from the Caribbean also to Asian countries or other countries with cheaper wages. So there has been a process of defeminization. And women have had to, many of them, that's why we have so many Dominican workers or Dominican people and women here, because they've migrated to other places. And finally, just let me mention that the 2008 economic crisis, and that you probably remember, led to many cases of defeminization because many of the, including China, China lost so much investment at that point, not so much, suffered from the crisis that affected especially women workers. But not only China, but many other countries, from South Africa to Spain. So there was another case of feminization. We could talk about it for a long time. So, by way of conclusion, despite the many gains made by women on different fronts since the 1970s, many problems remain, particularly at the lower levels of the world labor hierarchies, because that's where women tend to be. And then, as you students who might be interested in these issues, in inequality in economics and so forth, I would say focus on class and exploitation in addition to inequality, discrimination, and gender inequality and discrimination. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Despite you are a little bit sick, you surprise us with all the useful and amazing information that you share with us. So I don't know if could we make you some questions? If
there's time.
Yes.
Yeah. Not very difficult. So
or maybe a comment or whatever. Any comment, question? We need a microphone, just a second. No, because we have records, so you need to use the microphone.
Està encès?
Interessant que sigui un noi, no? Sí.
És una mica més d'aigua. Has passat molta calor, oi?
Tu creus que està encès, això?
Sí, tu no veu que posa...
Jo parlo i no sé.
Surten.
So I thought there would be some interesting questions, but anyway, I just want to comment something. I was thinking that the gender gap is more acute in the private sector. So in the public sector, when you have state intervention, it's more difficult to justify the gender gap. So I was thinking that we read a text by the introduction in the 6th chapter of your book, at least the guys from the second year. I saw that there's a kind of a Marxist approach, a little bit, or some traces of a leftist ideology, but for neoliberals that defend the absence of state intervention, how do they cope with this gender gap and the evidence that in the private sector is more acute? How do they deal with it? What do they propose? I don't know.
Well, I'm not a neoliberal. So, so I'm not sure I can answer the question, but when we see what's happening, essentially the neoliberals don't want state intervention or regulations, but they accept them one day there is no other way. When, if, for example, there is some labor regulation, I did not talk, I had a slide to talking about international labor standards. You know, there was in the 80s or not 90s maybe, there was a big debate among feminists about the need to use the ILO to press for international labor standards. What does it mean? Well, it means it would have meant some regulation from the ILO that would put some rules and regulations about minimum wages or perhaps other aspects of work depending on what kind of work we're talking about, right? There is a whole literature on international labor standards, and the ILO has been the international UN body that controls or deals with that. And interestingly enough, even among feminists, there was no agreement. Many of us pushed for introducing international labor standards, for example, in Bangladesh. Women and men should not work more than 48 hours, for example. It's about time worked. There's about all kinds of regulations that have to do with health, with income and wages. So there was many feminists who were pressing for international labor standards. And even some feminists who are real feminists and are very well known, they thought that they were not for it because it would decrease the investment in those countries that had international labor standards adopted. If you're the case of Bangladesh, going back to Bangladesh, there is a very well-known economist, a friend of mine, Naila Kabir, who is from Bangladesh. She teaches in London, in the London School of Economics, and she was worried about the fact that if Bangladesh adopted international labor standards, there would be fewer multinationals investing, and the advantage that Bangladesh had won over the years would disappear. And she was not alone. There were many, and of course, the neoliberals, men and women. Not that she's neoliberal, she wouldn't call herself neoliberal, but she was quite adamant on this issue. So that is a very neoliberal argument, saying that if you leave the market free, investment will flow from one country to another, and there will be a better way of channeling investment globally and create employment. So it was not, international labor standards were not really imposed on Bangladesh. Very few countries tried to, Cambodia did with the help of the ILO and some others, but in general, that is what won was the neoliberal, essentially the neoliberal arguments. And the result is what we have now. The market, if we leave it alone, it leads towards certain tendencies. The tendency in 2019 is for inequalities to increase because there is not enough regulation, not enough impediments for this market to not lead towards exploitation, which means basically the expropriation of people's, women's, or whoever works, labor, which generates benefits, and they go where? To the big global banks or wherever, to more investment. So this is the neoliberal world that we have. I don't know what, you asked me something else. Did I answer what you asked?
Yes, it's this debate between working conditions and investment. I see it, that states try to bargain with their economic policies to attract investment, and this has some consequences, but yes, of course, thank you.
But note that in Davos, somebody mentioned Davos, you did? In Davos, you see the neoliberal world is in crisis, has been in crisis. And we don't know yet what this is going to mean. I mean, for many of us, it would mean, well, let's construct something different. A world that's more regulated, that tries to put a stop in some of the extremely unregulated, starting with finance, not only investment. But we will see. I don't think, given the situation that we have globally, I don't think, first of all, in Davos, I don't think much has been accomplished along the lines of talking about an alternative world and greater regulation.
Good afternoon. Thank you so very much for being here with us. I'm so grateful for having the opportunity to listen to you. My question is about knowing your opinion about how the new plans to reach development, empowering women with small credits and women as entrepreneur agents, like based on the hypothesis that women are more responsible, they are handing in small credits for development in different communities. What is your opinion about that? And also, if it could be possible, what would you think it would happen if gender inequalities were solved with all of the unpaid work women do, like for the reproduction of life? If we could solve this inequality, what would happen, or how would economy would change if there was no unpaid work left? Thank you.
I don't think some unpaid work has to remain somewhere. Anyway, with this idea of unpaid work, I forget the microcredit question. The microcredit question. It's a big field. The microcredits, a big field in the sense that there's been so many people talking about it as a solution to women's problems. Also, this came out of Bangladesh. Initially, the economist who got the Nobel Prize, his name is escaping me now, but he got a Nobel Prize for his work on microcredit, his suggestion that women are very good borrowers, they are very good on time to return what they owe to the banks and so forth. So it became a big thing. But your question leads to say, well, what has happened? Well, the answer is that a mixed answer. In some ways, it has helped some women, but overall, they have not changed the world, the microcredits, the way some people expected. Many of us never expected that the world can change at that level. Yes, at the micro level, perhaps for some women it works, especially in Asia, also in Africa. But what has happened is that the microcredit institutions, like banks or sometimes the smaller institutions, not big banks, have become also very exploitative in some ways. And for some countries, they have a very bad opinion. Many people, Mexico, for example, has many examples of microcredits given at very, very high interest rates, which at the end do not really help women that much. So I think that the picture is very mixed. And the other question about unpaid work, it was interesting, because maybe we all we dream about the idea that maybe we won't have to cook and go shopping and take care of children and take care of older people for free. But we have a long way to there. Some unpaid work will remain. What we can think of is the state taking over some of these services, and mostly women, but also some men now, do for example, taking care of children and housework and taking care of the elderly. That, according to some estimates, they say that in 2050, it is possible that some people will get to live to 120 or 130 years, as a matter of fact. So be prepared. I won't be there, but you are young. Maybe you still. So that means that we need a lot of people to take care of so many years, unless people can keep living very young. In Asian countries where they're making more progress, to invest, mostly public but also private investment, in services that take care of the elderly. Japan and South Korea are ahead in this. And in the Mediterranean countries, especially Spain, which has a very long life expectancy rate, Spain is, I think it's the second or third after Japan and South Korea. We better start thinking about it also, because otherwise the older population is going to have a lot of needs to be taken care of, or maybe they will keep being young and will take care of themselves.
Hi, hello. Thanks for the talk. I'm in Rosa's class, Gender and Globalization, and this week we talked a lot about feminism. I noticed that you several times said when you are a feminist and then said we, as if you were a feminist. And I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts about how it has been calling yourself a feminist in an economic field, which, let's face it, has been male-dominated traditionally. So more of a personal question of how it has been, or maybe changed during the last 30, 20 years.
Well, I can talk forever about this. I'm not going to. Well, economics is the most sexist of the social sciences. And it's not curing itself of the disease to a great extent, although things are getting better. There is such a thing now as Feminist Economics, and there is a journal which is internationally well recognized called Feminist Economics. There is courses on gender and development, for example, or gender and economy in many. Well, not so much. Usually these courses are not in economics departments. They are in some interdisciplinary program in different universities. But they are there. And economists that have not adopted, who never call themselves, many of them would not call themselves feminists, but they have learned to live a little bit with it. But, for example, it's been a month ago, or less than a month ago, the American Economic Association annual meetings. These are meetings that can have as many as 12,000 people attending. They were met by a group of women economists who protested against discrimination in job, in salary increases, in wage gaps. Still now, after years, I remember the first time that we created sort of a women's caucus in New Orleans in the annual meeting, and many economists thought that there was such a nuisance, these women bringing up these topics. They didn't seem to think that they were interested at all. Now they've gotten used to that, but still the problem remains and remains. I'm not saying that there are not men that are listening, but overall, economics is still a hard science. We moved into economics from feminism through feminist economics, not through the general profession. Feminist economics meaning institutionally sort of separated. There is an international association for feminist economics. If you want to look at it, go into the internet. It's the one that publishes feminist economics. And many people that are not necessarily dealing with women's courses, including men, publish in their journal, but it's mostly women.
Hi. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Lourdes, for coming. My question is concerns the question of childbearing, because I'm told that it's one of the greatest sources of the gender gap, because women, traditionally speaking, has this role of taking care of the children. So I don't know what I'm gonna do in the future, but I know I want to be a father, but I don't want to oppress my wife. So I don't know what to do. And one of the solutions that the Chinese tradition, because I'm a Chinese, offers is that we give this childbearing mission to the elders. So we both parents go to work and we leave the children for the elders to take care of. And this also gives a solution to when our grandparents don't have anything to do, they can take care of the children. So, I'm proposing this solution to you to see if this is a viable solution. Thank you.
Well, you've seen the reaction in the. It's a possibility, because one possibility. I will not rely on this system, because also in China, you must have a generation. There will be. Well, one child, but now you will have more kids, right? So it's not just one, but two, and that it makes it more difficult for people that, I can tell you by experience, that when you get older, your power, physical power diminishes. So you have problems. You cannot lift a child or something like that, and so they couldn't do everything. Older people cannot do all the tasks required by child care. I doubt it. I'm surprised that China is not moving more into the investment coming from the state, creating daycare centers and facilities for child care. You will probably think, why do you think that China will? Because China can control public investment in a sense that, in a way that many other countries cannot. So I would say that the solution might come partially from grandparents. Spanish grandparents take care of the grandkids to a great extent. We have some experience with that. But also public investment will have to be coming in some way or other.
Maybe one last question? Or comment? So maybe we just finished the first session here. So we have some minutes to just rest or just drink a coffee or maybe walk a little bit, all the people who are not in a proper chair. I'm just sorry about that. So I would like just to thank very much the effort that Lourdes has made for us, despite she's quite ill. So I just ask you just clap your hands and see you at 6 in the second session.